Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show, and welcome to another week in exciting, wonderful, and wacky South Africa. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how's it going up there in Pretoria, the nation's capital?
Yes, no, capitally, it's going well. It's going fine. I'm now sort of in the space that will, in due time, become, less chaotic than just random books piled behind me. So excuse the aesthetics; they will improve over coming weeks.
Yes, he promised to have a very fancy bookshelf to show off all of his books. It's a kind of subtle, in the podcasting world, this is a sort of subtle intellectual flex. You put the most interesting books you can on the shelf behind you.
While I was sorting my books, it was a legitimate concern because I've got 2 copies of Mein Kampf. I've got Foster the Man by the John de Oliveira or something. And I'm just like, ooh.
Herman, are you trying to get yourself cancelled? Because we all know this is going to get taken out of context by someone.
How did you get employed by the IRR?
Yeah, exactly.
I showed them my copies of Mein Kampf, apparently. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah,
we read these things, and so I actively wondered, what will people make if they see just Mein Kampf peeking over
Herman,
my shoulder? But
Herman,
it's context.
No, please.
It's a book worth reading, not worth following.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, and Ms. Sara Gon. Sara, how are you?
I'm very well. My son once said the problem with Kindles as a means of reading books is that you can't show people how well read you are.
No, exactly. That's exactly the problem with them.
It was a spectacular Onion spoof where they said this problem has now been remedied by a Kindle setting that you can tell it to once a minute announce to the train carriage what book you're reading. And if you're reading a book that you don't want to be announced in public, you could have a different book announced. This person is reading 1984. So, I mean...
Right.
Wonderful. I'm so glad.
But enough joking around. We must get to the serious news of the day. And this is unfortunately... it looks like we've got another raft of another permutation of bad legislation that could be coming down the track. It seems that our government has finally decided to have a new idea, and it's not a great one, I must say. So rumors are swirling, and I think there was some discussion on the radio this morning about a job reservation law that would be reintroduced into South Africa, and there's some talk that this is going to be announced in the State of the Nation address, which is, I think, on Thursday. The idea behind this law, and I don't think we know the specifics of it yet, is that foreigners will be barred from certain sectors of the economy, and in other sectors, foreigners will have strict limits on what percentage of the workforce they can form a part of. So, for example, I don't know, maybe let's say waiters can only be 10% foreigners, and steel manufacturers can only be South Africans, and whatever. The scope of this would be quite something. And yeah, so I suspect this is probably going to be quite a popular piece of legislation. I suspect that's why the ANC is going for it. What's been interesting over the recent couple of months is that even the sort of supposedly Pan-Africanist organizations like the EFF have suddenly decided that actually, Pan-Africanism is not really that important. What's more important is winning the votes of people who are concerned about foreigners taking the jobs. And so we've seen a very deliberate sort of lurch towards being anti-foreigner. Now, a lot of people will very justifiably point out that South Africa does have a huge number of illegal immigrants, that our borders are effectively uncontrolled, and that social services and jobs are at a premium already. So do we really need more people? So Herman, let me start with you. How do we balance these issues of people who are hardworking, ready to work, coming here to contribute to our society, become South Africans maybe, and the fact that South Africa's sovereignty doesn't really seem to exist in a lot of practical ways?
Well, you get South African sovereignty to exist in practical ways. The problem here isn't that illegal immigrants sneak through very secure borders with criminal intent and malicious intent to come over here and take our jobs. It's the fact that my washing line is perhaps more immigrant-proof than the South African borders that we have to our northern neighbors. Now, I'm a firm believer in the nation state. And one of our colleagues said earlier this morning in a meeting that you cannot really have a nation without borders. And I think there are several philosophical and practical defenses of it. But one of them being that if you accept that the state as a concept must exist or will exist, Aristotelian, in an Aristotelian way, man is a political animal, so the state will, some form of a state, whether it's a church, whether it's a corporation, some statal entity will take hold. Then it's a practical question of its jurisdiction. Up to which hill on the horizon can you expect that state's laws, regulations, customs, traditions to apply? So sovereign and national borders, I think, is an inevitability. I don't think you can get around it. And I know there are liberals who believe in, complete open borders. I just don't think that flies. People like the idea of nation-state symbolism, and just the practicalities of the limits of jurisdiction requires this sort of thing. And then you can also take it through to some of the economic arguments, which I don't find particularly convincing in the South African context. But good research in the UK shows that the higher the level of immigration, you get downward pressure on your poorer income brackets because, it's competition for labor and work. And in South Africa, I don't quite buy that. We have unemployment of such a massive scale that, the influx of illegal immigrants don't really affect the supply or demand of workflow. If anything, they might boost the demand for employment in South Africa. But there are very real concerns about immigration. How do you solve this problem? Well, you don't let the government get away with pointing at Johnny Foreigner. Now, one of the problems here that we have is that we have very clear ideas over many decades of polling what South Africans think across racial lines of racial divisions. And the South Africans are in the main a quite tolerant, non-racial, sensible, middle-of-the-road bunch. I don't know where we sit on the mark of immigration. It is a very convenient scapegoat. And the real tragedy is, at the end of the day, when all is said and done, I cannot think of what problem will be solved by making some sectors exclusionary in terms of nationality. And something that the government will run into, I promise you, is just the plain and simple wording of Section 9 of the Constitution. Some constitutional elements attach themselves to South African citizens, because the equality section of the Bill of Rights, everyone is equal before the law. It's not every citizen, every South African. It is everyone is equal before the law. So there's a real constitutional question here. So I babbled through a few things. Firstly, I think we have to face the facts of immigration. They need to be controlled for the sake of nationhood symbolism, the jurisdiction of a state, and also the economic considerations. Number two, you cannot just easily lump these people together as one sort of entity, because you will run into the identity politics that will end up destroying any civilization. And number three, it's quite blatantly unconstitutional. Now, Kevin Johnson says Hermann needs to go live in a squatter camp before he comments on immigrants. He lacks EQ. I mean, this isn't a question of EQ. This is a question of straightforward fact, considering the facts on the ground. And Kevin, if you were listening carefully, you might realize that I was paying heed to that symbolism of the necessity of legal immigration and controlled legal immigration. So if we're going to have this discussion, let's have it along sensible lines. And let's not buy into the standpoint epistemology of critical race theory. That is just the road to intellectual ruin. But the problem the government faces here is there's no way I can see this to sensible application. It doesn't get past Constitution, and it doesn't solve a single problem that the government hasn't caused.
So, Sara, we were having a little bit of a discussion before this, and we know that a lot of sort of race nationalists and race hustlers and people who trade in race for their political power have made a point of trying to blame a lot of South Africa's ills on whether it's white monopoly capital, greedy whites, Indians, clever blacks, as Jacob Zuma once called some South Africans. And as Hermann pointed out, actually a lot of South Africans are pretty keen to get along racial lines. So I think that that's at least part of the reason why that hasn't been as effective as I think a lot of sort of race hustlers would like to have believed that it would have been. Unfortunately, I have a deep fear that blaming everything on foreigners will have a lot of ground. I saw there was a survey, I think in 2019, which said that something like half of South Africans believe that unemployment was due to the large number of foreigners in the country. Now, I'm not sure if that's correct. Take me with a pinch of salt there, but do you think, and of course, while both white, black, Indian, colored South Africans can all point to racism targeting them, we haven't had anything like the violence against foreigners directed on racial grounds. Do you think that this is a new direction for some of the sort of race socialists in our country, that they're going to move towards blaming foreigners instead of other racial groups? What do you make of this, Sara?
I think this is as old as man has been in existence. It's basically whenever there's a strain on resources, whenever there's pressure, particularly economic, there can be a whole lot of other factors, but those two in particular will lead to blaming the other. And a lot of the foreigners live in and work in and have created businesses in townships and in areas in which low middle class to working class to the poor live. So they are visible. What they do is visible, and the very fact that you have such high levels of unemployment, it's almost like a script being written, to which the process of disaffection and dissatisfaction with what the government has produced moves along a continuum, and foreigners become the other. And the problem with becoming the other is that the way to keep a lid on it is to have a government that keeps a lid on it, a government that does not give into the sort of visceral fears and anger of people based on something that no one, I'm prepared to bet that no one has figures on the extent to which foreigners do or do not fill the workplace to the detriment of South Africans. The problem here is, as it often is the case, is that being a fairly popular cause, because it's a visceral, emotional cause, the government is starting to plug into it. I mean, as you say, Julius Malema, the great Pan-Africanist, suddenly he's marching on restaurants to see how many
right. And hilariously, the EFF claimed on Twitter that they're checking the number of foreigners employed in restaurants was to help their African brothers and sisters. I don't quite know how, but
let's put it this way. What they were supposedly doing, which is pretty much illegal all the way, is actually the job of the Department of Labor. And frankly, there isn't a department, I think it currently, and I hope I'm not being too rude to departments that are performing, but I have no doubt that one of the things that the Labor Department is struggling to get to is how many foreigners are employed in, particularly small and medium-sized industries. That's the way of life. That's what happens in countries of all stripes and shades. So you really need a government that does two things. One is it actually implements for the first time a proper immigration policy, which it polices, which unfortunately I don't think they can do one way or the other. And the other is to stand up strongly in the media, in public, against this sort of behavior. So at least you have some sort of check, not an absolute check, but some sort of check on what is otherwise an understandable but fallacious cause.
And
right.
Nick,
so,
if I could quickly
can I
add
just
something.
make one more?
Yeah,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Just very, very briefly, is if we were to look at the actual job situation in South Africa, and we were to track it over immigration, the early 2000s was a golden period of immigration into South Africa, legally and illegally. And yet, in the middle of that decade, following on years of immigration driven by the introduction of a social grant state and also very good economic growth in South Africa, unemployment went down, not up. So there isn't this quite straightforward idea of immigration good, immigration bad. There is, I think, common ground on what we can find in terms of the government isn't doing its job on illegal immigration. And a last little factoid, go look at what happened in Uganda the moment Amin kicked out the Indians. Most of them went to the UK. Within a generation, they were back to middle-class lives. The data shows that, where Uganda actually suffered from the loss of skills and resources. So if you're going to go for the foreigner, remember the Nimola poem of, at first they came for the sis and so, but I didn't speak up because I wasn't a sis and so. Scapegoating always ends with the majority group finding a victim group. And this is an example of that.
Right now, and you know, the issue with xenophobia and fear about foreigners taking jobs and that kind of thing is also so tied to all of our other problems. There's accusations I've heard from people, very poor people, who tell me things like, you know, the foreigners, they're getting all the RDP houses. Well, the only reason that there's any truth in that is that people are bribing to get ahead on housing lists. Or they'll say foreigners are selling drugs. Once again, that's a law and order issue. That's because the police don't work properly and are not able to properly crack down on drugs. People will say the foreigners are getting employed ahead of South Africans. Well, that's because Zimbabwe's education system, until relatively recently, was of a much higher quality than South Africa's, and so people are willing to hire, you know, Zimbabweans who have excellent education over South Africans who have come through what in a lot of cases is just a sort of warehouse for children until they are kicked out. And until we fix these underlying problems, you can restrict all the foreigners in the world you like, and it's not going to make the lives of a single person in this country better. It's exactly the kind of zero-sum politics that the ANC has been playing with for a very long time now, except now it's changing its target from white monopoly capital to Zimbabweans and Mozambicans. Sara, any final thoughts?
Let me put it this way. This anti-Semitism has always resulted in people being killed or people fleeing. And it's generally historically been found that societies that have Jews and then lose Jews suffer economically.
Yeah, no, exactly. Anyway, we will have to see what happens. Like I said, we don't know how concrete all this is. We don't even know if any of this will be able to get through legal challenges. But I think this is an idea that needs to be discussed, debated, and, you know, the concessions made to the legitimate concerns about the poorest states of our borders, while at the same time not falling into the trap of xenophobia. Anyway, let's move on to our second topic, because we have spent a good long time on this one. The Judicial Service Commission announced over the weekend that it had decided that it was going to recommend Appeal Court President Mandisa Maya as the next Chief Justice. And many people hailed this as a quote-unquote progressive move, that a black woman was going to be made Chief Justice. There was a lot of pushback, however. Part of the reason is that some of the interviews on the Judicial Service Commission were sort of derailed by political party fighting. In this case, between Dali Mpofu of the EFF and Ronald Lamola from the ANC, where during Judge Zondo's interviews, the whole thing dissolved into a big shouting match between the two of them at the end, which kind of, I think, took the focus off of the proceedings. And then there's also been some criticism that I haven't read and I don't understand, because I don't understand anything about the law really, which suggests that the Judicial Service Commission overplayed its hand here, because ultimately I believe it's the president who's supposed to pick the Chief Justice, and that's sort of making this big public announcement as who they think should be the next judicial leader was unbecoming of them. Anyway, there have been a lot of people chiming in on this. The Helen Suzman Foundation has said they want to take the Judicial Service Commission's process to court, saying that it was not up to standard. Tuli Madonsela criticized the whole thing, saying it was a sham, and Helen Ziller said it's past time we remove politicians from the Judicial Service Commission. Sara, what do you make of this?
Well, let's put it this way. As we've seen before, this is an opportunity for Malema and Mpofu to have a go. They create a scenario where there ultimately will be a shouting match, and that is the whole idea. And what happens is they do it to try and cast aspersions on a particular candidate to make that candidate less likely to be favoured. And they certainly tried that with Dunstan Malambo. And that's really what they're there to pull that card. It's not a sort of heated spur of the moment thing. It's intended to create an impression. And if it upends the process completely, well, that's fine. They'll come back and they'll do it again. Because if you think about the last set of Judicial Services Commission interviews, they behaved badly. It went to court. They were told to do it again. This time it's more difficult because you're going, how do you take to court an issue affecting the top court of the land?
Right.
And they absolutely, now that they've got the space to move, Malema, Mpofu in there again. So it's really games playing. It's intended, as I said, it's intended to cast suspicions. With Malambo, it was sexual harassment. With Zondo, it was essentially aspects of the commission that they felt they could pull at to I think to create some sense of it being not entirely worthy, or whatever the right words would be. So the bottom line is Helen Zille's right. I mean, when you're going for something as serious as judicial appointments at any level, but particularly at this level, the only thing that matters, unless somebody has a very distinct cloud hanging over their head, is their judicial suitability for the position. And you need experts, and you need probably 3 people. You don't need 25 or however many end up sitting on this damn thing. And least of all, it is supposed to have a level of decorum and seriousness that warrants it being conducted by people who know the law and know and are competent to judge what we should expect from those who are meant to uphold the law.
So I must say, I think take a different view to you, Sara, and to what Zille has said here, which is that I don't think it's necessarily, the problem is not necessarily that we have politicians, it's that we have such a low quality of politician on these things.
Well, that's really why you want to get rid of the politicians, because you have no guarantees.
Right. And actually it's up to the South African people to hold their politicians to account on this one. I mean, that's as far as I wonder what EFF supporters, the ones who aren't in the sort of cult-like trance that some seem to be, think of the antics of Dale Mpofu and Julius. Hermann, what do you make of this?
Yeah, no, I mean, the Helen Suzman Foundation will take the JSE to court. I think that's a silly idea. I think we should take them to the grave. I mean, it is really the most embarrassing political structure in South Africa, without a moment's hesitation. I'll say that it is unbecoming, and it is undeserving of any serious consideration. And the tragedy of it is that on paper it seems to be able to function. But Nick, I actually want to join with you. There is the standards of politicians in South Africa is really down to the voter, and this isn't going to win me any friends, but that's never been my strong suit anyway. So the fact of the matter is, one can complain and bitch about these things till kingdom come, and one can go about one's business. But as long as politics is someone else's problem, as long as getting people to vote for what you believe in is someone else's problem, we'll get this standard of politics. If every single person that voted against the ANC and the EFF, for all the other parties, in the 2019 election went out and convinced just one person who didn't vote in the previous election to vote in the next election, just one, we'd have a new government majority overnight. This is an interest in democracy, an interest in constitutional stability and sense issues. This, I'm afraid, is down to South African voters who've, for a century now, shut down for matters of public policy. The JSE is perhaps the most embarrassing manifestation of what the public's lack of interest in the quality of politicians has resulted in. It is a mirror more than anything else, and it shows that if you're going to allow politics to become the province of idiots, you're going to have idiots elected. I think it was John Adams who said to his son, can't remember the exact quote, but it is that public service is a service that will be done. If wise men choose not to do it, those who are not wise will. If men who are prudent choose not to do it, those who are not prudent will. If you are going to try and detach yourself from the politics of this country, and you're going to be upset by what's going on here, but you haven't once tried to get a non-voter to vote for a cause you think worth voting in, then I think we've still got a bit of work to do before we start looking at those Australia citizenship applications.
Sara, final thoughts on this before we move on?
Just a shout out to Cameron's comment about Malema being involved. What one has to remember, of course, is the man is genuinely shameless. Any attempt to score a point, negative or positive, that highlights him, however we would consider embarrassing, it doesn't matter. And that's why, as I say, I think Helen Zill is right. You need to get rid of politicians because you don't know what you're going to get in the worst sense of the word.
All right, let's move on to our final topic. We don't have a lot of time to cover it, but let's see how fast we can do this. So a lot of people have been following, I think it's one of the world's, if not the most popular podcast in the world, this being the Joe Rogan Experience, has been under fire a lot in the US recently. So Spotify, the music streaming service, made headlines a couple of years ago when it signed an exclusivity deal with Joe Rogan, agreeing for a substantial amount of money that Joe Rogan would only upload his podcast to Spotify. Well, ever since then, there have been attempts to get the show kicked off of Spotify. There was a recent one, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, where artists such as Neil Young wanted their music pulled from Spotify's catalog because Joe Rogan had expressed views on COVID that they said were not consistent with science, and he had invited on guests which they said spread incorrect nonsense about medicine and science, all that kind of thing. It seems like I think Spotify ultimately didn't decide to take any action. And then recently there was a series of clips released by some left-wing activist groups which showed Joe Rogan on some of his older episodes saying the N-word, the racial slur. And Joe Rogan replied, he said that he was taken out of context in these clips and that he was quoting someone who had used the racial slur. He wasn't using it himself. He said he did apologize, saying, look, he thinks that he shouldn't have actually said the word itself. I never used it to be racist because I'm not a racist, he said. Well, there were demands that he be kicked off of Spotify, and there's now been a response by the Spotify CEO, Daniel Ek, who said, while I strongly condemn what Joe has said and agree with his decision to remove past episodes from our platform, I realize that some will want more, and I want to make one point very clear. I do not believe that silencing Joe is the answer. We should have clear lines around content and take action when they are crossed, but cancelling voices is a slippery slope. Looking at the issue more broadly, it's critical thinking and open debate that powers real and necessary progress. Anyway, a lot of it actually is fairly sort of woke in its leaning, the rest of the statement, talking about like balancing listener safety with a diversity of views. But the overall point here is Spotify is standing by their guy, as much as he is their guy. It's not really their guy. But anyway, Hermann, very briefly, your thoughts.
Well, the searches for who is Neil Young spiked shortly after he threatened to pull his music from Spotify. So, I mean, that tells you a bit about his relevance. But I do think it's rather pathetic. I do think it is pathetic that the pill popping hippie-dippy assholes from the 1970s who believed in everything freedom then now can suddenly turn around and say the real cool thing is to obey the man, to go with the establishment. Anyone who is a free thinker, oh dear, I'm going to take my millions away. I think it is really pathetic, and it just shows that if you're going to make celebrities your public intellectuals, you have to expect the intellectual capacity of celebrities to determine intelligent conversations. And that is a shameful situation.
Sara, your thoughts?
What I like about Spotify is that in this era of woke, and where you have Nike and similar brands just bending over backwards in the wokosphere, they're actually in their own way standing up for their capitalist, self-interested money-making thing, which I think is incredibly healthy. I mean, presumably they wouldn't have let they would have thrown Joe Rogan under the bus if he was less he was less rewarding than Neil Young. So I think it's a bit of corporate pushback, shall we say? Even if there was a lot of rubbish about your safety and your security or whatever they were talking about.
So I just want to say as a final thought, I mean, I don't really get too bothered if people want to if they don't want their music on Spotify or whatever, it's their choice, it's their music. But I will say, I think maybe this suggests that the cultural power of canceling is diminishing somewhat. I mean, that's a very easy prediction to make, but one that has proven, a lot of people have said that over the years, and we still haven't reached peak woke yet, but maybe this is the beginning. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for watching. We will see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.